Welcome to the University of Liverpool podcast. I'm Neil Morrison. On this week's episode, Calum Semple shares his experience working in Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis. It is a harrowing story that offers some surprising lessons. It turns out large-scale Western intervention of the sort Calum was involved in may not have been the key to conquering the outbreak. In fact, the key may have been something far, far simpler. That's coming up after this.
You're listening to the University of Liverpool podcast, brought to you by the University of Liverpool online programs. Make a plan to advance your career today. Study a postgraduate degree with a world-class university without leaving your home or full-time job. You don't have to go far to go further.
It's difficult to remember now the growing sense of panic that gripped the world at the beginning of the summer of 2014. At that point, Ebola had killed 350 people in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, and the number infected was growing rapidly. Médecins Sans Frontières warned that the disease was out of control and called for a massive influx of resources. Just 3 months later, by August, Ebola had now reached hospitals in the US and Spain, and as the death toll topped 1,000, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared Ebola an international public health emergency.
The committee's conclusions and my decisions are a clear call for international solidarity. Countries affected to date simply do not have the capacity to manage an outbreak of this size and complexity on their own.
By the end of that summer, the WHO warned that 20,000 more people could become infected. At this stage, the disease was killing 1 out of every 2 people infected, so that prediction was terrifying, and the world moved into full-scale crisis mode. In October, it turned to Dr. Calum Semple at the University of Liverpool. The WHO wanted his team to assess the research capacity of the various treatment sites in Sierra Leone. A few weeks later, he was on the ground in the country.
It was unlike arriving at any other international airport. First of all, the airport itself is quite small, as is typical for many of the smaller African countries. But when the doors opened, the ground crew were already wearing face masks at the bottom of the stairs. And then as we walked across to the main terminal, before we could even enter the terminal to start showing papers, we had to wash our hands in what was essentially just dilute bleach. It turned out it was 1% bleach in water, which stings the fingers and stains your clothes. There were some quite shocking scenes. The walls of many of the streets were adorned with public health messages about not having physical contact with people suspected to have Ebola, what the signs of Ebola were. And we did actually pass on that very first day people lying in the street who were sick, who under other circumstances people would normally go and give assistance to. But in November 2014, in the midst of the worst Ebola outbreak, the correct thing to do was to phone for the Ebola ambulances and keep a safe distance. And certainly our group could not offer any humanitarian assistance to these individuals. So that made this job unlike any other that we had engaged with.
The Sierra Leonean government had asked the WHO to give advice on how to run a trial on the use of blood products as a treatment for Ebola.
If we wind back to think, why are we using any blood at all? blood has essentially two major components. There's the cells, the red cells, the white cells, and the platelets. And there's this lovely golden fluid called plasma, which the cells float around in. In the plasma, there's a chemical called antibody. And antibody is very important in dealing with infection and protecting from future infection.
Antibodies are the disease-fighting proteins that your body uses to fight infections. The reason you generally don't get chickenpox twice is because your body builds up antibodies the first time you are infected. This is the way vaccines work. Your body learns how to build antibodies against the illness. In this case, the idea was to take blood from people who survived an Ebola infection, and here's why. If they survived Ebola, that must mean they have antibodies to fight the disease. And if you take their blood and give it to someone else, you are passing along those antibodies. It's almost like a form of vaccination.
In fact, sometimes it's called passive immunization, in that you're, rather than actively encouraging the body to generate its own immune response, which you do with a vaccine, you're passively giving that person the antibody component in its raw form.
Now, the easy way to do this is to transfuse a pint of blood with the good antibodies into someone who needs it. But there are a few problems. First, the blood type needs to be an exact match.
And the second problem is that the person that you've taken a pint of whole blood from is now 1 pint of blood short. And you don't have that many pints of blood to give.
So Dr. Semple and his team were looking for a way around this. Instead of using whole blood to get the antibodies, they wanted to use one component of the blood, plasma, that lovely golden fluid. The antibodies are in the plasma.
The advantage of using plasma is that there are machines. They're essentially centrifuges with a filter and some clever tubes connected to some saline. And these machines can take about half a pint of blood at a time, separate the plasma from the cells, give the cells back to the donor, and keep the plasma. And after a number of cycles of doing this, you can generate roughly 600 mils of plasma, give all the cells back to the donor. So the donor then leaves the blood transfusion center feeling absolutely fine because they've not lost any blood. All they've done is given a bit of the golden juice that contains the antibody. Now, past experience shows that within 3 days, the donor replenishes the plasma that they've made. It actually takes 3 months to make the red cells. So if we took the red cells, it would take months for them to completely restore the red cell population. But we're only taking the plasma, and they sort that out within 3 days. So that donor could potentially come back time and time and time again.
Plasma is also easier to store than blood. It can be frozen, and it can be given to any number of recipients. It does not need to be carefully matched.
So plasma is a far more flexible product. It's a safer product, and it's safer both for the donor and the recipient. And that's why plasma has advantages.
But the process of extracting that plasma is not so simple. The Sierra Leoneans were quite skilled at blood transfusions, but the move towards producing plasma was a significant leap.
Now, we were working in a country that has never before gone beyond giving whole blood. They've never developed their own blood products facility. And here we're coming in, taking them from basic blood transfusion technology onto generating plasma. So we had to build the infrastructure and train the local blood transfusion technicians in how to make the plasma. And they're already well trained in blood transfusion technology. It's just they've never had the opportunity to do this.
Now, you may have noticed a subtle shift there. Dr. Semple and his team were doing the training and helping to set up the plasma facility. But remember, the initial mission was to analyze their capacity to do this work and then suggest possible partners to work with them. However, when they sat down with the team in Sierra Leone to suggest possible partners, the Sierra Leoneans were impatient to get started, and they wanted to just start the work with Dr. Semple's team.
The situation on the ground was awful. It really was quite terrible. When we were in the middle of one of the briefing meetings with the Sierra Leonean investigators, the meeting was interrupted by one of the secretariat who came through with a folded piece of paper and handed it to the chair of the meeting. And that was to announce that one of their colleagues, a respected physician, had just died from Ebola. And so even during the conduct of these discussions, the Sierra Leoneans were being told of the death of their colleagues. Now, when we were in that country, we heard that there were about 100 doctors on the medical register for Sierra Leone. And this is a country the same size as Scotland and roughly the same population as Scotland. That's just over 6 million people. And yet they only had 100 doctors. Half of the doctors were very senior and involved in the administration of the Ministry of Health and Sanitation, leaving really 50 or fewer doctors in the hospitals providing direct clinical care. So when you are in a meeting with notes being passed in saying that one of their colleagues has just died, you get a reality check. You have to realize that you can't go back and have discussions with executives about the rights and wrongs of protocol for giving advice as independent people or giving advice as institutional experts. Much in the same way as you had that paradox of not being able to approach a man that was lying in the street. You're in the room thinking, well, this is what you can do, and this is what you are able to do. And so we rolled up our sleeves and got on with it.
So the team did just that. They informed the WHO that they needed to abandon their role as independent observers and take on the role of active partner. And then they got going.
The amount of work that we then did over the next 3 days, we held 2 workshops and a writing group to thrash out the bones of a protocol for a clinical trial. We achieved that within 3 days, and the first draft of that protocol, which was we completed the writing of the draft in I think the second week of November, and we had ethical committee approval on the 5th of December. And we're in country in January, ready to start a clinical trial. So that's very, very fast.
By the end of January, the number of Ebola infections dropped to its lowest number since June of the previous year. And 4 months later, the World Health Organization declared an end to the Ebola outbreak in Liberia. And 6 months after that, the WHO made the same declaration in Sierra Leone. Now, since his time in Sierra Leone, Dr. Semple has been studying the impact this project had on the trajectory of the Ebola crisis. And he's come to a sobering conclusion.
To be honest, none at all. We, even getting started as quickly as we did, we missed the peak of the outbreak as far as patient numbers were concerned to enter into a clinical trial. And the geography of the outbreak meant it was hard to recruit patients to our study. And there was also significant competition from other clinical trials that were later set up that attracted patients to be presented to these sites in preference to ours. So, putting it bluntly, the trial aspect of our study had no impact on outcome for these patients.
This is what makes this such an interesting case. Here you have a terrific example of Western medical intervention. Plasma production requires highly sophisticated techniques and it has the potential to greatly increase the number of people who can be treated. Relatively speaking, it is technologically advanced and powerful, two things we might consider to be hallmarks of Western medicine. And yet, in the final analysis, it did very little to stop the disease. But Dr. Semple's team was not alone. Around the time his team was on the ground, there was a significant surge in the international response to the Ebola crisis. And shortly after that response was at full strength, the Ebola crisis subsided. The simple conclusion would be that this massive intervention had a huge impact.
I think the easy answer is to say, yes, things got better when the West came in. I think it's a rather naive view. Speaking personally and from my understanding, what made a big difference was the local public health message around safe burial and changing the burial practices of people that had died of Ebola, and also a message around how to care for people that had signs of Ebola. So the provision of the Ebola treatment units and the Ebola holding units provided safe areas where people could go and be treated safely. And that some of that infrastructure was provided by the international response. But personally, I think what made the difference was behavioral change and the message that was coming through from the public health ministries and through the media. And that was what was breaking the cycle of transmission.
It may seem surprising that the thing that broke the cycle of transmission was not the labs, not the influx of Western medical teams and experts, but rather a simple public health message around how to treat people who are infected with or who have died from the disease. However, to get a sense of how important this would be, consider the custom in Sierra Leone for handling the dead.
The major difference in West Africa was a practice of close contact with the body fluids after people had been washed down. People dipping fingers in or splashing it around and putting it onto their faces, which was being practiced by some communities. And this meant that the washing products and body fluids from one person could be shared through a great many people. In fact, sometimes several hundreds of people would have contact with these body fluids. And that led to huge amplification of the Ebola infection within the local communities.
So here's what I'm wondering. Looking back on it, if your own work did not have a significant impact on controlling the outbreak, and if the other large Western projects weren't the key drivers for controlling the outbreak, what should our takeaway be from the experience of managing Ebola?
I think the large scale intervention by some of the NGOs did improve the capacity and the numbers of sites that could provide essentially safe havens for people to come and be isolated in a degree of safety. So that may have had some impact. But I think that the Ebola outbreak was broken by the change in the public health message. So I'm not discounting that the NGO and charitable actions and the British military actions didn't help. I'm just saying that I think that the public health message and the change in the human behavior was probably more important in breaking the cycles of transmission. So the non-contact and the safe burial was terribly important. The impact of our study was actually the secondary legacy work that came out of our training of the blood bank team in how to use blood products. So we now have a cadre of staff in Freetown who can do quite sophisticated research techniques and run quite sophisticated biochemical analysis. And that's something that they didn't have before.
So the impact may in fact be longer term?
Yeah, I think the impact, the legacy work. So we now have a legacy of research at MH34 in Freetown with a team looking after the survivors' eye problems and the survivors' neurological problems and the survivors' muscular problems, and that's a great legacy. We've had over 500 survivors come to Freetown for post-Ebola syndrome medical care.
So already it's having a tremendous lasting impact. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
It's my pleasure.
Calum Semple is a senior lecturer in child health at the University of Liverpool. And if you're interested in public health, you may want to check out the University of Liverpool's online Masters of Public Health. We now have regular listeners to this podcast around the world. So if you are one of our listeners in North or South America or Africa or Asia, check out the show notes for this episode, and we will have a link to the online Masters of Public Health. And if you liked this episode or any of our previous episodes, please give us a rating or a review in iTunes. If you do this, it helps with our overall ranking in iTunes, and that helps other people to find us. Thanks so much for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks. I'm Neil Morrison.
You're listening to the University of Liverpool podcast, brought to you by the University of Liverpool online programs. Make a plan to advance your career today. Study a postgraduate degree with a world-class university without leaving your home or full-time job. You don't have to go far to go further.